The gavel was already raised. 15 years. That was the price tag the state of Massachusetts put on my father's life for a crime he didn't commit. I had survived mortar fire in Kabul, but nothing prepared me for the war I was about to wage in courtroom 302. I am Captain Sarah Jenkins, United States Army, Judge Advocate General's Corps. For 6 years, my life was defined by the rigid parameters of military justice, prosecuting and defending soldiers in windowless rooms halfway across the globe. I knew how to cross-examine a hostile witness while sirens wailed in the distance. I knew how to maintain total emotional detachment. But all of that training evaporated the day I received a crackling satellite phone call in the middle of a dust storm in Afghanistan. It was my mother. Her voice, usually a steady, comforting anchor, was fractured and hollow. "Sarah," she sobbed, the static threatening to swallow her words. "They found him guilty. The judge gave him 15 years. They took him away in handcuffs." The world stopped spinning. The roar of the Black Hawk helicopters taking off from the nearby airstrip faded into a muted, underwater hum. My father, Arthur Jenkins, was a 62-year-old logistics manager for a massive chemical manufacturing firm called Crowley Industrial in Boston. He was the kind of man who woke up at 4 in the morning, packed a bologna sandwich in a dented metal lunchbox, and worked 50-hour weeks without a single complaint. He was a man who rescued stray dogs and spent his weekends fixing the neighborhood kids' bicycles. He was not an arsonist, and he was certainly not a murderer. But the Suffolk County District Attorney had painted a very different picture. 6 months prior, a devastating fire had ripped through Sector 4 of the Crowley Industrial Warehouse. The blaze was ruled deliberate, started by a highly combustible solvent. Worse, the night watchman, an old family friend named Thomas Riley, had been trapped inside and died of smoke inhalation. The company needed a scapegoat. The DA, an aggressively ambitious man named Gregory Hayes, needed a high-profile conviction to fuel his upcoming mayoral campaign. And my father, the man who held the keys to Sector 4 and had recently filed an internal complaint about missing inventory, was the perfect target. The narrative they spun was sickeningly neat. Arthur Jenkins was stealing industrial chemicals to sell on the black market, and when Thomas Riley caught him, Arthur set the fire to destroy the evidence, leaving Thomas to die. My father's civilian attorney, David Lipton, was a tired, overworked public defender masquerading as a private practice lawyer. He had been completely outgunned by Crowley Industrial's corporate lawyers, who handed the DA neatly packaged, heavily redacted documents that pointed solely to my father. Lipton hadn't fought. He had barely objected. By the time I secured emergency leave and stepped off the plane at Logan International Airport, my father had already been transferred to the Sousa Baranowski Correctional Center. The first time I saw him in that sterile, claustrophobic visiting room, it broke something fundamental inside me. The Arthur Jenkins I knew was a giant, a man with broad shoulders and a booming laugh that could fill a stadium. The man sitting behind the reinforced plexiglass looked shrunken, drowning in an oversized khaki jumpsuit. His hair had turned entirely white in a matter of months. I picked up the heavy black receiver. My hand was shaking. "Dad," I whispered, pressing my free hand against the cold glass. He offered a weak, trembling smile. "Look at you, Sarah, still wearing the uniform. You look good, sweetheart. You shouldn't be here. You have important work to do." "You are my important work," I said, my voice hardening. The shock was wearing off, replaced by a cold, tactical fury. "I've read the transcripts, Dad. I read Lipton's defense strategy, or lack thereof. He let them walk all over you. He didn't subpoena the security logs from the South Gate. He didn't challenge the fire marshal's chemical analysis. He surrendered." My father looked down at his calloused hands. "Sarah, Crowley Industrial is a billion-dollar company. Richard Crowley himself testified that I was the only one with the override codes for that sector. The DA had bank statements showing a $10,000 deposit in my account the week before the fire. I don't know how it got there, I swear to you. But the jury, they looked at me like I was a monster. "I know you're not a monster," I said, leaning closer to the glass, locking eyes with him. The JAG officer in me was taking over. This wasn't a father and daughter anymore. This was a defense counsel and her client. "Dad, I'm filing an appearance as your lead counsel. We are filing a motion for post-conviction relief based on ineffective assistance of counsel and newly discovered evidence." He shook his head, a tear finally escaping and tracing the deep lines of his weathered face. "Sarah, please, don't ruin your career over a lost cause. Richard Crowley owns half the judges in this city. You can't fight an army by yourself." I sat up straight, squaring my shoulders. "I'm not by myself, Dad, and they have absolutely no idea what kind of soldier they just brought into this war." The transition from a military base in Kandahar to a civilian courtroom in Massachusetts was jarring, to say the least. In the military, there is a rigid adherence to procedure, a respect for the chain of command, and an unspoken brotherhood even among opposing counsel. In the Suffolk County Courthouse, it was a knife fight in the mud. I converted my childhood bedroom into a war room. The floral wallpaper of my youth was soon covered with corkboards, red string, crime scene photos, and thousands of pages of financial transcripts. I didn't sleep. I survived on black coffee, adrenaline, and a burning, righteous anger. My first objective was reconnaissance. I needed to understand exactly how Richard Crowley and DA Gregory Hayes had built their trap. I reviewed the trial footage. Hayes was theatrical, pacing the courtroom, pointing an accusing finger at my father, painting him as a desperate man drowning in secret debts. The debt was a medical bill for my mother's brief hospitalization 2 years ago, which my father had already paid off. But Hayes twisted it, making it seem like a motive for black market theft. Then there was Richard Crowley. The CEO was a polished, silver-haired aristocrat who wore custom-tailored suits that cost more than my father made in a month. On the stand, Crowley had feigned deep sorrow. He testified that my father was a trusted employee who had sadly lost his way. He claimed that the internal security system, which logged every door opened and closed in the facility, showed Arthur Jenkins' unique keycard swiping into Sector 4 just 10 minutes before the fire alarms triggered. But as I dug deeper, the military investigator in me began to see the cracks. In a combat zone, you learn to look for what isn't there: the absence of a patrol, the sudden silence of a village. In this case, it was the absence of the raw data. During the trial, the prosecution had introduced a printed spreadsheet of the security logs. Lipton, the useless defense attorney, had accepted it at face value. But where was the original digital metadata? I filed a flurry of aggressive subpoenas, demanding the raw digital logs from the third-party security firm that monitored Crowley Industrial. DA Hayes immediately filed a motion to quash, citing undue burden and arguing that the case was already closed. That led to my first appearance in courtroom 302. The morning of the hearing, Boston was buried under a bitter, freezing rain. I chose not to wear a civilian designer suit. I wore my Army service uniform. The dark blue jacket, the brass buttons, the ribbons on my chest. I wanted every single person in that room to know exactly who they were dealing with. When I pushed open the heavy oak doors of the courtroom, the low murmur of conversation instantly died. DA Gregory Hayes, who was leaning casually against the prosecution table, joking with his junior counsel, stopped mid-laugh. He looked me up and down, a smirk playing on his lips. "Well," Hayes muttered, loud enough for the gallery to hear, "I didn't realize we were being invaded." I ignored him, walking straight to the defense table and setting down my heavily organized tactical briefcase. I arranged my files with absolute precision. Judge Wallace Bennett entered. He was a stern, uncompromising man in his late 60s, known for his utter lack of patience. He adjusted his glasses, looking down at the docket, and then at me. "Captain Jenkins, I presume?" Judge Bennett's voice was like grinding stones. "I read your motion to substitute counsel. It's highly unusual for a military attorney to parachute into a closed-state felony case on a post-conviction relief petition. Furthermore, you are the defendant's daughter. That borders on a conflict of interest." "Your Honor," I said, standing at attention, my voice projecting clearly across the mahogany-paneled room. "There is no conflict of interest in providing competent, zealous representation, which my client was severely denied during his initial trial. As a licensed attorney in the state of Massachusetts, I have every right to appear on his behalf. I am here because the man who raised me was railroaded by a fabricated narrative, and I have the evidence to prove it." Hayes scoffed, standing up. "Objection to the theatrics, Your Honor. The defendant was convicted by a jury of his peers. The appellate period has expired. Captain Jenkins is on a fishing expedition, wasting the court's time because she is understandably emotional about her father's guilt. I turned to Hayes, my expression entirely deadpan. I left my emotions in a combat zone, Mr. Hayes. What I brought to this courtroom is a forensic digital expert's affidavit. I turned back to the judge, handing a crisp folder to the bailiff. Your Honor, the prosecution convicted my client based on a printed spreadsheet of security logs. However, under the rules of discovery, they were obligated to provide the native digital files. My predecessor failed to demand them. I did not fail. I subpoenaed the third-party server company directly. What you have in that folder is the metadata for the night of the fire. Judge Bennett opened the folder, his brow furrowing. Explain this to me in plain English, Captain. Gladly, Your Honor. The printed log shows my father's keycard swiping into Sector 4 at 11:15 p.m. But the digital metadata, the unalterable code generated by the server itself, shows that the swipe was manually entered into the system 2 days later by an administrative override. An override that belongs to the CEO, Richard Crowley. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the courtroom. Hayes' smirk vanished entirely. He scrambled to look at his own copy of the motion. Furthermore, I continued, my voice gaining momentum. If you look at page 4, you will see that at 11:15 p.m. on the night of the fire, my father's physical keycard was actually swiped at the employee cafeteria on the complete opposite side of the complex. It is physically impossible for him to have started that fire. The logs presented to the jury were doctored. Hayes was stammering now. Your Honor, this is an unverified report. The security firm could have had a glitch. A glitch doesn't manually type in a specific employee's ID code 48 hours after a fatal fire. I snapped, stepping out from behind the defense table. Your Honor, this is perjury, evidence tampering, and a gross miscarriage of justice. I am asking for an immediate evidentiary hearing to cross-examine Richard Crowley under oath. Judge Bennett stared at the paperwork for a long, agonizing minute. The tension in the room was pulled so tight it felt like it might snap and take someone's head off. Finally, he looked up, his eyes locking onto mine. He saw the unwavering discipline, the absolute certainty of a soldier who had already mapped out the entire battlefield. Motion for an evidentiary hearing is granted. Judge Bennett slammed his gavel down. Mr. Hayes, you better have Mr. Crowley in this courtroom next Tuesday, and God help you if this metadata is accurate. As the courtroom erupted into frantic whispers, I packed my briefcase. D.A. Hayes glared at me from across the aisle, his face flushed with panic and rage. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply snapped my briefcase shut, gave him a curt, military nod, and walked out. The first shot had been fired, and we had drawn blood, but I knew Richard Crowley wasn't going to surrender his empire without a fight. The real war was just beginning. And next Tuesday, I was going to put the billionaire on the stand and tear his life apart piece by piece. When you challenge a billionaire in his own backyard, the counterattack is rarely a frontal assault. It comes in the shadows. 2 days after the hearing, I walked out of a diner in South Boston to find the driver's side window of my rental car shattered. A single, jagged brick sat on the driver's seat. There was no note. In a combat zone, an unspoken threat is just intel. It tells you that the enemy is watching, and more importantly, that the enemy is terrified. I didn't report it to the local police. D.A. Gregory Hayes had too many friends in the precinct. Instead, I taped up the window, drove back to my childhood home, and locked the doors. I pulled out my secure laptop, tapped into a few favors from military intelligence analysts I trusted with my life, and began hunting the money. The DA's smoking gun had been a $10,000 deposit into my father's checking account. It was the supposed blood money for the black market chemicals. But Arthur Jenkins still used a checkbook and kept his ATM receipts in a shoebox. A mysterious digital wire transfer made 0 sense for a man who didn't even have a banking app on his phone. Tracing the routing number through standard public channels was a dead end. It bounced through 2 shell corporations before disappearing into the ether. But corporate greed always leaves a digital fingerprint. I requested the tax filings for Crowley Industrial's subsidiary branches. One specific entity, Apex Logistics in Delaware, caught my eye. The registered agent wasn't Richard Crowley, but his chief financial officer, David Hammond. When I cross-referenced the wire transfer's origin bank with Apex Logistics vendor payouts, I found a matching routing sequence. The $10,000 hadn't come from a black market buyer. It had come from Crowley's own CFO. They had framed him using their own corporate slush fund. But I needed motive. Why burn down Sector 4? Why kill Thomas Riley, the night watchman? The answer came from the most unexpected source. Thomas Riley's widow, Clara. I visited Clara on a rainy Sunday afternoon. Her small house smelled of lavender and grief. When she opened the door, her eyes widened at the sight of my uniform, but she let me in. "Clara, I am so deeply sorry about Thomas," I said gently, sitting across from her at a worn kitchen table. "But you know my father didn't do this. You know Arthur." Clara clutched a teacup, her hands trembling. "I know, Sarah. I've always known. But the lawyers, Crowley's people, they came here right after the fire. They offered me a massive settlement, a pension for life, as long as I didn't talk to the press or ask questions." "What questions did they think you were going to ask, Clara?" She stood up, walked to a locked mahogany cabinet, and pulled out a small, soot-stained leather notebook. "Thomas was old school," Clara whispered, handing it to me. "He didn't trust computers. He wrote everything down. A week before the fire, he told me he found something sickening in Sector 4. They weren't storing chemicals, Sarah. They were dumping them." I opened the notebook. The handwriting was cramped but clear. Thomas had logged license plates of unmarked trucks leaving Sector 4 at 3 a.m., heading toward the local reservoir. He had noted highly toxic solvent barrels being marked as empty and shipped out for illegal ground disposal to dodge millions in Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, compliance fees. "Thomas was going to the EPA on Monday," Clara said, tears spilling over her cheeks. "The fire was on Friday." The puzzle pieces snapped together with lethal clarity. There was no black market theft. Crowley Industrial was illegally dumping toxic waste to save millions. Thomas Riley caught them and was going to blow the whistle. Richard Crowley ordered the warehouse burned to destroy the barrels, the manifests, and the whistleblower all at once. And my father, the honest working-class manager who had just complained about inventory discrepancies, was the perfect patsy. I looked at the soot-stained pages. This wasn't just arson anymore. It was premeditated. Capital murder. I spent the next 48 hours drafting the most aggressive line of questioning of my career. I wasn't going into courtroom 302 to ask for a retrial. I was going in there to orchestrate an execution. Tuesday morning, the gallery of courtroom 302 was packed, shoulder to shoulder with local press, Crowley Industrial executives, and curious law students who had heard rumors of the JAG officer taking on the DA. My father was brought in through the side door wearing his orange jumpsuit. The guards removed his handcuffs. He looked exhausted, but when he saw me standing at the defense table, spine perfectly straight, a faint glimmer of hope returned to his eyes. "We got him, Dad," I whispered as he sat down. "Just watch." Judge Bennett took the bench, his face a mask of judicial granite. "Call your witness, Captain Jenkins." "The defense calls Richard Crowley to the stand." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Crowley stood up from the front row. He wore a charcoal bespoke suit, exuding an aura of untouchable wealth and arrogance. He swore the oath, sat in the witness box, and adjusted his silk tie, looking at me with mild amusement. "Mr. Crowley," I began, my voice echoing off the high ceilings. "You testified at my client's original trial that you were at home on the night of the Sector 4 fire. Is that correct?" "It is," Crowley replied smoothly. "A tragic night for our corporate family." "And you also testified that Arthur Jenkins was the only person with the security clearance to access Sector 4, which is why the system logged his entry at 11:15 p.m. "That is what the security logs showed, yes." I walked to the evidence table and picked up a thick binder. "I submit into evidence, Defense Exhibit D, the raw digital metadata from your third-party security server, and Exhibit E, bank records from Apex Logistics. Mr. Crowley, Are you aware that this metadata proves Arthur Jenkins's keycard was manually typed into the log by your administrative account 2 days after the fire? DA Gregory Hayes leaped out of his chair. Objection, Your Honor. Captain Jenkins is badgering the witness with unverified cyber theories. Overruled, Judge Bennett barked, leaning forward. The witness will answer. Crowley's polite smile faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered. As a CEO, I have administrative access. It's possible I was reviewing the system post-incident and triggered an accidental overwrite. It was a chaotic time. An accidental overwrite, I repeated coldly. Just like the accidental $10,000 wire transfer from your CFO's shell company, Apex Logistics, into my father's checking account, the very transfer used to frame him for theft. The courtroom erupted into frantic whispers. Hayes's face drained of color. Objection, Hayes yelled. Relevance, scope. Sit down, Mr. Hayes, Judge Bennett thundered, slamming his gavel. Captain Jenkins, you are walking a razor's edge. Get to the point. Gladly, Your Honor. I stepped closer to the witness stand, locking eyes with the billionaire. I channeled every ounce of military discipline I possessed, stripping the emotion from my voice until all that remained was cold, hard steel. Mr. Crowley, let's forget the key cards and the bank accounts for a moment. Let's talk about fire safety. Sector 4 housed highly combustible solvents. Because of this, it was equipped with a state-of-the-art halon gas fire suppression system, a system designed to instantly suffocate any flame. Crowley swallowed hard. Yes, standard industrial safety protocol. According to the fire marshal's report, that halon system failed to deploy, I said, picking up a single sheet of paper from my table. At first, the state assumed the explosion damaged the pipes. But I didn't assume. I subpoenaed the manufacturer of the halon system, a defense contractor based in Virginia. Their systems are hardwired to an off-site black box. Crowley's hands gripped the wooden ledge of the witness box. His knuckles turned white. I took 2 steps toward him, raising the document. I have the black box log right here. The system wasn't damaged by the fire, Mr. Crowley. It was manually deactivated before the fire started. I paused, letting the silence stretch out, thick and suffocating. Here is my question for you, Mr. Crowley, I said, my voice dropping to a deadly whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the room. If my father, a low-level logistics manager, started that fire at 11:15 p.m., how did he bypass the military-grade biometric thumbprint scanner required to disable the halon suppression system at 11:10 p.m.? A scanner that, according to the manufacturer's unalterable uplink, registered exactly one print, your right thumbprint. The one question. The kill shot. The silence in courtroom 302 was so absolute, you could hear the rain hitting the glass windows. Crowley's jaw dropped. His eyes darted wildly toward Hayes, who was frozen in horror. The polished, aristocratic CEO suddenly looked like a trapped animal. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked at his right thumb, then back at me, his chest heaving. Crowley stammered, sweat beading on his forehead. I invoke my Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. Pandemonium? The gallery exploded. Reporters scrambled for the doors. Clara Riley sobbed into her hands. D.A. Hayes slumped into his chair, dropping his pen, realizing his mayoral campaign and his career were entirely pulverized. Judge Bennett slammed his gavel violently, furiously demanding order. It took 2 full minutes for the bailiffs to quiet the room. When the noise finally settled, the judge glared down at the prosecution table with a look of pure disgust. Mr. Hayes, Judge Bennett said, his voice trembling with rage, in my 30 years on the bench, I have never seen a more grotesque abuse of the judicial system. Not only is the state's case built on perjury and fabricated evidence, but it appears you have aided in covering up a homicide. The judge turned his attention to the defense table. His harsh expression softened, just for a fraction of a second, as he looked at me and then at my father. Arthur Jenkins, the judge declared loudly, your petition for post-conviction relief is granted. The conviction is hereby vacated with prejudice. You are a free man. Bailiffs, remove those restraints immediately. The heavy clink of the chains hitting the floor was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. My father stood up, his legs shaking. He didn't look at the judge, or the crumbling billionaire, or the terrified district attorney. He turned to me. I stepped around the heavy oak table and threw my arms around him, burying my face in his shoulder. For the first time since that phone call in the Afghan dust storm, I finally let myself cry. "You did it, Sarah," he wept, holding me tighter than he ever had. "You brought me home." "I told you, Dad," I choked out, smiling through the tears. "You don't mess with the United States Army." Later that afternoon, Arthur Jenkins walked out the front doors of the Suffolk County Courthouse, not in a prison uniform, but in a borrowed suit, breathing the cold, free Boston air. We watched as Richard Crowley was escorted out in handcuffs by federal marshals, with the EPA and the FBI closing in like sharks. I traded the battlefield of Kandahar for the battlefield of Boston, and I won. Because when you threaten a soldier's family, you don't just get a lawyer, you get a war. Thank you for reading this incredible journey of justice, military grit, and a daughter's unwavering love for her father. If this courtroom takedown gave you chills and proved that truth always prevails, smash that like button. Share this story with anyone who loves a powerful underdog victory, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more gripping real-life drama and untold stories. What would you have done in Sarah's shoes? Let me know in the comments below.